Worshipful Master, I present to you Mr. Martin, a candidate properly prepared to be made a Mason.
Many of the 500,000 men initiated into Freemasonry in Britain are involved in local government. But is there a conflict of interest between Freemasonry's secret oaths and the public service?
Do you seriously declare on your honor that, unbiased by the improper solicitation of friends against your own inclination, and uninfluenced by mercenary or other unworthy motive, you freely and voluntarily offer yourself as a candidate for the privileges and mysteries of Freemasonry?
I do.
I do.
The averred aims of Freemasonry are highly moral ones. The only problem arises in that they also insist that you should support the group, fellowship with other Masons. The message is you can't stand on your own. You need us, and you can quite see that the thought of being out in the world naked without that would be very frightening, and that some people might well let loyalties to other more abstract institutions go by the wayside.
By thy glorious majesty.
The English language is littered with Masonic phrases like being on the level, upright and true, and getting a square deal. Masonry's symbolic tools are supposed to be reminders of its moral code. But up and down the country there have been allegations of Masonic corruption in local authorities, from Cardiff to Bradford, from the north of Scotland to the south of England. Southend on the Thames estuary is typical of many seaside resorts. It seems to be virtually controlled by Freemasons. The Masonic Hall houses 43 craft lodges, 23 Royal Arch chapters, and many other Masonic orders. This town of 50,000 adult males contains 3,000 Masons from every walk of life. But do Southend's other residents know anything about Freemasons?
It's like a lodge, isn't it, where people go, you know, you want to get on a bit. You're a Freemason, aren't you? And you're Masonics.
Brother speaks for brother, don't they?
Yes. Secret society, yeah.
What do they do?
Not a lot.
Not a lot.
Not a lot, no.
They shake
Well,
hands.
they're so secret we don't know what they do.
Yeah, they do. They stick
They've
to
got a special,
another, don't they?
yes, small. They've got a special handshake. They wear silly leather pinnies and they're a secret society.
How powerful do you think they are in Southend?
Probably fairly powerful, I should imagine. There's a lot of very wealthy people about here that are very interested in doing that sort of thing.
Bunch of bastards. So man. The firm I work for is mainly run by Masons. Unfortunately, that led to a lot of people who aren't particularly good at their job getting into influential places.
Well, they're all over the place down here, everywhere you go.
Do you know who the Freemasons are?
Yes.
Yes, we do. What sort of firm do you work in?
I wouldn't like to say, especially on camera. But you know who you are, don't you?
One of Southend's most eminent Masons is William Muckley, an ardent member of Crowstone Lodge, number 3298. For most of his working life, he was employed by Southend Council, and for 10 years he controlled all the town's council house allocations. But in 1979, Mr. Muckley moved in with his mistress in a council house she had just been allocated by his very own department. Muckley thereby attracted the attention of Paul Foote of the Daily Mirror.
That's how it started. I think we then found a number of other cases. In fact, one of the nastiest cases that occurred there, which wasn't to do with Muckley himself, but with one of his junior officials, was clear evidence that one of the junior housing officers there was housing divorced and divorced women and single parents in exchange for sexual favors, a thing which you can't imagine anything really more disgusting at that level. You can't imagine anything more revolting than that. And we exposed that as well. And I think all these things had roots in Masonry, Freemasonry.
Foote's revelations caused outrage in Southend. One Conservative councillor, Chris Hudson, was inundated with letters from angry constituents. He's not a Mason. He was concerned about the newspaper's allegations and called for an independent inquiry into the conduct of Mr. Muckley and the Housing Department. But Southend's Masons closed ranks.
It is an established fact from Masonic records that members within the Housing Department, officers, were Masons. That's just a question of historical fact. And it is a fact that several of my colleagues, former colleagues on the council, were Masons, and they stuck together like glue.
Only days after the revelations in the Daily Mirror, Brother Muckley was installed as Worshipful Master of Crowstone Lodge. He was also promoted to Chief Housing Officer by Southend Council and given a large salary increase. At the same time, Councillor Hudson's pleas for an independent inquiry into Masonic abuse were turned down by the same council, and he was suspended by his Conservative colleagues from every committee on which he sat.
Their behaviour, their conduct in this town, as regards me and my position as a councillor, was appalling. I was shocked and appalled. I was very concerned at the press this town was getting. I did everything I could to have an inquiry, and yet certain members within the Freemasonry wanted to keep the lid on things, keep the can of worms quiet, if you like, down in Southend.
Hudson took his suspension to the High Court. He claimed that democracy was being bypassed in Southend, partly as a result of the cosy, back-scratching relationships enjoyed in the town's Masonic lodges. The High Court upheld his complaint and instructed that Councillor Hudson be reinstated. Worshipful Brother Muckley was made redundant from his post as Chief Housing Officer in 1985. Southend said they had too many chief officers and he was nearing retirement. Since then, he's worked at a garage, but has just been given a job as a physical and recreational instructor at a local coeducational high school. Muckley's lodge meets at Southend's Masonic Temple, as do many other lodges. For these brethren, Freemasonry may be harmless socializing, but not to some outsiders.
Because they mingle in secret and because they tie one another up in this secret bond to one another, the tendency among all these people that are in this secret society is to defend one another rather than to expose one another to public accountability.
Accountability is very important in local government because councils spend huge amounts of ratepayers' money. Newham Council in the East End of London has an annual budget bigger than many third world countries. In 1980, a full roll of 75 members of the Borough of Newham Lodge leaked out. Non-Masons were horrified to discover the extent of Freemasonry's influence in the Labour-controlled borough.
It actually permeated the whole social fabric of the borough. The membership of the lodge indicated that there were members of the council, senior members of the council in membership. There were the officers, the senior officers and lower officers. There were contractors. There were even police connections.
Newham is just one of many councils with town hall lodges attached, where elected councillors, council officials and outside contractors meet in Masonic secrecy. But it isn't only the obvious town hall lodges which raise anxieties. In Rochford, Essex, a conservative stronghold, Masonic influence has been the subject of stormy debate. Councillor Richard Boyd, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, contends that Freemasonry in Rochford is the Tory party in disguise, and that Tory councillors meet council officers in the same Masonic lodge.
There is a standing tradition in local government that paid officials do not attend caucus meetings of political parties. The reason is to prevent undue influence by one party on officials or the ability of one party to obtain information, privy information, which is not made available to others. Now, if that rule is followed, it becomes illogical if you then all nip down to the Masonic lodge that evening and the members are from one party and paid officials. It destroys that attempt to separate political life from private life.
Boyd became concerned about Masonic influence in 1982, when the old council chamber was sold to local Masons without being put on the open market. It's now a Masonic temple. At least 4 Conservative councillors who were on the committee which authorised the sale were also Freemasons, but saw no need to declare an interest. We asked all these men about their conduct. None would respond, but a Mason who's become a councillor since the decision argues that Masonic councillors are under no obligation to declare themselves.
First of all, I think it is an impertinence to ask me as an individual what I do with my free time and my free money if I'm partaking in something which is not illegal or immoral, and Freemasonry is neither of these things. The next thing that we shall be asked to define It's how much money we give to various charities, whether we drink South African sherry, etc. Where is the line drawn?
If there's a planning application concerning my wife, I declare an interest. If there's a planning application to turn the redundant council chamber of Rochford into a Masonic meeting place, which they buy, I would expect members of the Masonic movement to declare an interest. Well, they didn't.
Despite many Freemasons' protests, the issue of concealed membership is very often at the root of public mistrust of the Brotherhood, especially so in job promotions, when a Masonic candidate is found to have been chosen by other Freemasons. The 1981 appointment of Alf Parish as Chief Constable of Derbyshire was a case in point.
Really quite bizarre. Mr. Parish was appointed Chief Constable in a rather strange way. Many of us thought with undue haste at the time. Sadly, the Chief Constable at the time had tragically died of a heart attack. It was in April of 1981, and we were conscious that in May of 1981 there was likely to be a change of control of the County Council.
The new Chief Constable was hastily appointed by a subcommittee dominated by the ruling Tory group, which looked likely to lose the forthcoming elections. Parish had been the serving Deputy Chief. It could be argued he was likely to have got the top job anyway, but his was not the only rushed promotion.
That was followed by an even more startling appointment of Mr. Parish's deputy, Mr. Parkinson, who was appointed literally hours before the election, just one day, without proper adverts to satisfy the Home Office, and in spite of some considerable criticism from the Home Office, again it appeared that there was undue influence in both of those appointments.
With the new Chief Constable and his deputy now firmly ensconced at police headquarters, Labour gained its predicted victory and David Bookbinder became council leader. But not until 3 years later, when Bookbinder was sent a photocopy of the Derbyshire Masonic Yearbook, did he feel the mystery of Parish's selection was explained. Prominent in the list of Derby Masons was the name of Alf S. Parish, but there were also the members of the subcommittee which selected him. The Tory chairman, Angus MacDonald Miller, turned out to be a grand provincial officer of the craft. Also on the committee were the Masonic Tory councillors Roydon Green and Walter Marshall, formerly the Conservative leader of the County Council. Even the Home Office inspector attached to the committee, James Page, was a Mason in London. But by this time, Brother Alf Parish's tenure as Derby's Chief Constable was coming to a spectacular climax. Parish was retired in 1985 amid a scandal relating to over £30,000 expenses. But the Derbyshire Masonic Yearbook explained many other mysteries of county politics. For example, the membership list for the Tyrian Lodge, number 253, the county's oldest, which meets here at the Masonic Hall in Derby, included 2 former Conservative County Council leaders, 3 successive county clerks who had run the council for more than 20 years, the High Sheriff, and the former Chief Constable, Sir Walter Stansfield. Clearly, some Tyrian Lodge members had dominated county affairs throughout the 1960s and 70s. Other names loomed out from other lodges, yet more Conservative councillors, the Lord Lieutenant and the Duke of Devonshire. These confidential Masonic papers disclosed a business, political, police and social directory of the entire county. They revealed Freemasonry's extraordinary power in Derbyshire and its effective role as the county's secret government.
You could say that it was the informal controlling body of Derbyshire County Council. It certainly successfully had its members appointed in their most sensitive and key positions that exist in this authority. It could all be a coincidence, but it really would be a very remarkable one.
The Tyrian Lodge of Derby does seem to contain a substantial slice of Derbyshire's ruling elite.
I hear what you say, but I could also tell you that Freemasons are taught from the very beginning of their Masonic activity that they're not to use Freemasonry to advance any sort of interest. The lodge may contain some important people, but that's an accident. They're not there to influence any sort of exercise any sort of influence at all.
It was no accident that certain Freemasons exercised a corrupt influence over many English local councils in the 1960s. That's when the Pontefract architect John Poulsen scooped up contract after contract by bribing local and national politicians. But when he was jailed for corruption in 1974, his Masonic connections were scarcely known, and he's written to us denying that Freemasonry ever helped him in business.
I was an enthusiastic, loyal member of my lodge for many years. I found Masonry fascinating, and I gave myself enthusiastically to its service. I can only say I did not use Masonry to further my business interest.
Poulsen's right-hand man and public relations fixer during the 1960s was the flamboyant T. Dan Smith, one-time boss of Newcastle City Council and dubbed by the press Mr. Newcastle. A non-Mason himself, Smith contradicts his one-time paymaster by claiming that Poulsen became a Mason in order to make contact with influential Labour politicians.
He said to me, I'm not a Mason, but I'm going to become a Mason, because he said, Joe Blackburn, who is the mayor of Pontefract, I think was the mayor of Pontefract, and also the leader of the Pontefract Council, has convinced me that there are so many Labour Party local authority people Masons that I must have some means of contact because I'm known to be a Tory. And I believe that I'm right to be a Tory, and I'm not going to compromise on politics.
For some Yorkshire citizens, the legacy of the Poulsen affair is a deep distrust of Freemasons in politics. In 1986, 3 Bradford researchers uncovered long-buried evidence of Masonic opportunism over council plans to build a bypass through the Leeds suburb of Headingley.
I think what we've always been interested in, and I think most ordinary people are interested in, is what are the backroom deals? What is the wheeling and dealing?
In the 1960s, Masonic wheeling and dealing involved a 5-acre plot of land, which was worth very little because it was inaccessible by road. But then Leeds Council earmarked half the land for a new bypass. The proposed road would give direct access to the rest of the plot, which would then rocket in value as prime building land. 20 years later, in the unlikely setting of a suburban bedroom, the 3 researchers began a painstaking investigation of company and council records, as well as confidential Masonic documents. They discovered that in 1966, 12 local Masonic lodges had banded together to form the Shire Oak Property Company in order to buy the 5 acres of land in Headingley.
That's a London one. So how were they divided up between local individuals and...
I think they seem to got rid of most of the shares to the actual lodges themselves in trust.
Many of the all-Masonic shareholders in the Shire Oak Company were Leeds councillors, and so in a good position to know the council's plans for the bypass. They included Alderman John Astle, JP, on the Transport Committee, Councillor Donald Bradley, Finance and Planning Committee, Lord Mayor and Alderman Alan Bretherick, Councillor Harold Jowett, Finance and Planning Committee, and Erwin Bellow, council leader from 1975 to 1979, when Mrs. Thatcher made him Lord Belwyn and Minister for Local Government. In 1974, Leeds Council set up a voluntary register of councillors' interests.
Not one of these councillors had ever declared their interest in this matter, and really that's what the registers of interest was set up to protect against people with inside information and inside influence on decisions actually profiting from decisions made at the council.
But as the 3 researchers found out, the Shire Oak Masons were to come unstuck. In 1976, Britain's Labour government announced huge cutbacks on road building. The local bypass was shelved, the value of the land slumped, and the Masons eventually had to sell out without making a profit. Even so, it is a matter of public concern that so many councillors had shares in a company which would benefit from their own council's decisions. Yet when the Shire Oak deal was exposed in 1986, the leaders of what was by then a Labour-controlled council did nothing to investigate their Tory forerunners.
It just seems like it's become par for the course, really, and I don't think it should. I think we ought to get to the point where we're shocked by things like this, and we're really not that shocked anymore.
The public may no longer be shocked by shadowy deals done in our local town halls, but we still like to think our national civil servants are incorruptible. Yet Freemasonry, which claims to demand high standards, is sometimes the breeding ground for corruption on a grand scale in the civil service. The Property Services Agency has an annual budget of £1 billion and employs 26,000 civil servants. It manages and maintains more than 8,000 public buildings, including the Tower of London and Hampton Court Palace. Recently, corrupt deals involving the PSA were hatched and executed under the cover of the Queenswood Lodge, which now meets here at London's Freemasons Hall. By the early 1980s, it was a honeypot for building contractors and corrupt civil servants. A key figure in the scandal was a contractor called Terry King. In 1981, King and a PSA officer, Eric Wenborn, were guests at a Queenswood Lodge ladies' night. Within a few months, both the builder and the civil servant were initiated as apprentice masons.
Having been kept for a considerable time in a state of darkness, what in your present situation is the predominant wish in your heart?
Light.
Brother Junior Deacon, let that blessing be restored to the candidate.
While in a state of darkness, Wenborn had worked incorruptibly as a civil servant for 35 years. But within a year of becoming a Mason, he was flying off to Las Vegas, all expenses paid, courtesy of his crooked builder brothers in the Queenswood Lodge. In June 1988, at the Old Bailey, Wenborn pleaded guilty to 5 charges of corruption and conspiracy to obtain bribes. The jury heard how, throughout 1983, his Masonic brothers had paid £1,000 a month into a Jersey bank account in his wife's name, about another free holiday in Miami, how he bought his mistress a £33,000 flat with his bribes, as well as spending money on his own home and buying himself a new car. Brother Eric Wenborn was eventually jailed for 2 years, a sad end to a civil service career that had spanned 4 decades.
What inquiries have been made by Grand Lodge following the recent court revelations of the involvement of a Masonic lodge in a network of bribery and corruption in the Property Services Agency?
Freemasons who were convicted by the court have been dealt with and expelled, and we've inquired into the affairs of one lodge which seemed to be concerned, and we find that there was nothing Masonically improper about it, and we are now inquiring into the affairs of another one. But we expect that we'll find, as we did in the first lodge, that there was nothing in the lodge which encouraged these people or allowed them to break the law.
Was this the Queenswood Lodge?
I can't remember which one of the two it is we sorted out.
In the Queenswood Lodge there were 2 contractors, 1 PSA official and 1 GLC official, and all were convicted of bribery and corruption.
Yes. That doesn't mean to say that the lodge caused them or allowed them or helped them to be conspirators. It's just an accident of life that these people happen to be in the same lodge. There might be a lot of other organizations that they belong to the same. It might be nice to think they all go to the same church.
However nice it might be, these corrupt men did not all go to the same church. They did all go to the same lodge. But does it really matter if some Freemasons in public service have failed to meet the high standards of morality which the Brotherhood proclaims? Should the public care about petty Masonic abuse of power, such as afflicted Southend's housing department?
The scandal itself may well seem petty, but underneath that petty scandal is a basic principle, and it's the principle that democracy can be strangled. And if it can be happening here in petty Southend, as we say, then what could be happening in other corridors of power on a more senior level? What happens in Southend could well be happening in Parliament. We need more open government to get at the truth. We represent the people, we are here in the name of the people, and we cannot have secret societies operating within a framework of democracy. It's a paradox, it's a nonsense.